One thing I hear quite often when people talk about the big popular MMORPGs is that they love flying around the environments. Final Fantasy XIV, World of Warcraft, and Guild Wars 2 all have mounts that allow you to fly pretty much anywhere in the game, giving a whole new perspective on the world's environments. But those games didn't always have the ability to soar through the skies when they initially launched. No, they were added in later expansions. However, one small forgotten MMORPG was, as far as I know, either the first one or one of the first to implement flying in MMOs. Fly for Fun, or Flyff, and apparently pronounced by the community as Flyff, is that MMORPG. Literally advertised within its name, Fly for Fun is a pioneer in having the ability to explore a game's world vertically through flying. It's a small feature when you think about it, but put yourself in the shoes of games back in the mid-2000s. MMORPGs just didn't really have exploration like that. Fly for Fun released all the way back in 2004 in Korea and 2005 in North America, and was developed originally by Aeonsoft. Development eventually shifted to Gala Lab Corp, whom continues to develop the game to this day. As you can see, Fly for Fun has been a long-standing free-to-play MMORPG in the landscape, but it's a game that is rarely known or talked about in 2024. I originally covered the game in a Dead or Alive video back in 2020, talking about the game's various struggles through its years. Now, with the game being 20 years old, I wanted to see if there is any reason to go back and play Fly for Fun in 2024. I remember it having a decently large player base back in the day when I played back in middle school, but in 2024, it's probably safe to say it's not as popular anymore. I would assume over the years the game has changed and evolved for the better though, right? Right? So one of the first points I have to make about this game is just how many official versions there are, because it can get a little confusing for a new player. First off is the original version of Flyff, otherwise known as Flyff PC. This is the current official game version that technically has the most current content and quality of life features, but ironically it has the smallest player base. Then there is Fly for Fun Legacy, which is a mobile game version that is like a Fly for Fun remastered, but from what I've been told, it's not a very good game. Finally, there is the browser-based version called Flyff Universe. Universe is currently the most popular version of Fly for Fun, most likely due to its sheer ease of access and universally praised classic gameplay. Think of it like a Fly for Fun classic, since its gameplay looks to bring a more classic social experience to its gameplay versus the faster beginner experience that Fly for Fun PC has. For this video, we will primarily be looking at Universe, since it is the most popular version of Fly for Fun in 2024 and is what most players will recommend to newbies. Graphically, Fly for Fun falls under a stylized anime look. In 2024, the graphics are definitely dated, but it's not the worst graphics I've ever seen for such an old game. Character models look cutesy and are detailed enough to look alright for a 20-year-old game. Environments are varied, incredibly colorful, and insanely vast due to the ability to fly in any area, but they do have blurry textures and relatively sparse details. Effects and animations can get flashy, especially in later character levels, but it's nothing really to get super excited over. Now, musically, Flyff actually has a decent soundtrack to listen to while you play. Many of the tunes are pleasant on the ears, and some may even get stuck in your head like the battle themes. It's It's no Tale in terms of absolute bangers, but I do enjoy what Flyff has to offer in terms of their soundtrack. Other sound effects can be a little hit and miss, though with many of them sounding strangely off for what they're supposed to be. For example, melee hits and bashes sound a lot like an arcade pinball machine, and many of the monster cries sound very similar to recycled sound effects from other games during this era. Truthfully though, the sound design doesn't have to be perfect, and these small little nitpicks are ignorable. Just like Fly for Fun's story. The story in Fly for Fun revolves around the magical world of Madrigal. If you pay attention to the dialogue during certain quests, you can learn about Madrigal's creator, the gods that created the elements, the protector of humanity, the clown gods, and a whole bunch of other weird stuff, but honestly, Fly for Fun released in a time when the story in MMORPGs weren't really a main focus. So basically, unless you really pay attention to NPC dialogue, there is essentially zero story. Anyways, character creation in Fly for Fun is where everything starts. The character creator here is pretty bare bones, having the normal choices of being either male or female, choosing between various facial looks, hair choices, colors, and finally a name for your character. Now you may have noticed you don't choose a class here. That's because you don't actually choose one until level 15. When you create a character, you start out as a vagrant. Yeah, I know, it's the name of my channel. Go figure. And no, this is not where the name of my channel comes from, but pretty cool class name, I have to admit. Once you press the start button, you are thrown into the beginning town of Flarin, where you are given a really rudimentary text tutorial. The small little penguin guy in the bottom right hand corner will teach you how to move, jump, navigate through menus, interact with objects, and fight in combat. I can't fault the game for not having much of a tutorial because realistically, a lot of us will just skip it, and what is here does do enough to teach you everything you need to know. Still, I'm surprised they never bothered to implement a proper tutorial in the 20 years the game has existed. Little bit of foreshadowing for topics later on in the video. Once you get your bearings on the game, you'll pick up a few quests and head out to start leveling up and engaging in combat. Combat in Fly for Fun is your standard tab target combat system. Double-clicking on an enemy will have your character start auto-attacking them with their equipped weapon. Skills you learn can be assigned to your hotbar down below, and depending on your class, you can also set up a skill chain where skills will play out in order, usually ending in a combo finisher skill for extra damage and effects. Enemies are pretty boring in the early levels, rarely having any sort of mechanics to interact with, at least until later levels where they may attack you at ranged, or specifically in the case of boss monsters, may have area of effect attacks that you have to actively dodge. Now this slow early level combat would be fine if leveling up introduced skills for you at a relatively fast pace to shake up combat, but sadly, that isn't really the case here. The game's combat is incredibly simple to the point of where you may only have 3 to 4 skills to use at the most, all the way up to level 60 plus, where your second job advancement occurs. Heck, even getting to level 15 to advance past the beginning vagrant class is a bit of a grind since you only get 3 skills to learn during the beginning class levels. This beginning grind is a bit of a chore, considering all you do during the early levels is complete the standard kill monster quests or fetch quests that plagued a lot of the early MMORPGs. Now you don't have to do those quests to level up. You can just continuously grind enemies to level up instead to level 15, but as a newbie, the quests will help you get to level 15 faster, so it's best to buckle up and just get them over with. Besides, you'll want to do all the quests you come across as you level up, and all of them pretty much have the same structure of killing enemies or talking to certain NPCs. As you level up, you gain 2 stat points and 2 skill points per level. Your stat points can be spent to increase one of the 4 stats, being strength, stamina, dexterity, and intelligence. Skill points can be used to learn or upgrade any current available skills up to a certain certain max level in that skill. Once you reach level 15, you can do your job advancement quest line. The class advancement quests have multiple steps that you have to complete just to finally have your proper class, with the 4 choices being Mercenary, which is your standard warrior class, Acrobat, which is your bowman ranged class, Assist, which is your healer class, and the self-explanatory Magician. Each class can then advance to a secondary choice at level 60. Mercenaries can become either knights or blades, Acrobats can become rangers or jesters, Assists can become bill posters or ringmasters, and finally Magicians can become Psykeepers or Elementors, giving a total of 8 different classes to choose from. In 2024, that's not a whole lot of class choices, and I was surprised to see that they still hadn't added any new classes to the game after all this time. To be fair though, in terms of progression and character customization, you can technically create unique builds within your class to make yourself stand out, but odds are you'll be pretty weak unless you follow a build guide. Progression in general is pretty lacking until you can start enchanting and upgrading your gear, which isn't recommended until higher levels. Enchanting and upgrading works very similar to old school scrolling in MapleStory, where equipment can be upgraded using either cards or dice to add extra stats and properties to them, up to a specific plus level. Failing an upgrade can mean destroying your equipment, however, so keep that in mind. Another system called Piercing also exists, which is basically Fly for Fun's version of adding gem slots to your equipment, where you can slot in card effects like extra stats or other perks you wouldn't normally have on that piece of gear. Pets are also another progression feature where enemies will drop eggs that can eventually hatch to pets. Each pet grants additional stat points depending on what pet hatched from your egg, and each pet can also have various ranks. In general though, the pet system is a huge time and money sink that most players will recommend you just completely ignore until higher levels. So once again, it's another feature you won't really interact with in the beginning. In terms of what other gameplay features Fly for Fun has, varies depending on what version you are playing. For example, player-owned housing does exist in Fly for Fun PC that is completely free to interact with. In Universe, you either have to purchase a house template in the cash shop or spend a ton of in-game gold. Achievements and alt-friendly bonuses are a feature in Universe, but are not a feature in PC. It's a bit of a confusing mess trying to figure out what the differences are between the two versions, and don't even get me started on the tons of private servers out there. I'm going to focus on what features are largely shared in the official versions of Fly for Fun. PvP does exist in Fly for Fun in some basic forms, and it's at least here, which is more than I can say for a lot of the games I've covered on the channel. It can be accessed relatively early in the form of the Duel Arena. The Duel Arena is where I saw most PvP players hanging out, kicking each other's butts, and generally just trying out different builds that work specifically for PvP. There is even a PvP ranking that rewards players for taking part in PvP with an item that resets each week, so there is even incentive to take part in dueling. The game also has a PvP channel where you can kill other players basically anywhere you are, but that channel is generally empty, and unless you are pretty confident in your PKing abilities, I would steer clear of this until you are a much higher level. Guilds also get access to a special PvP mode where you can go head-to-head in matches called Guild Sieges, so there is quite a bit of PvP to take part in, if you get strong enough, unless you are running restricted level PvP with other like-minded players. Endgame in Fly for Fun consists of leveling up to max level, making your perfect equipment for your build, and farming dungeons or world bosses to make money to fuel your progression. Fly for Fun has quite a lot of dungeons to explore and run with a party or guild. The most famous boss from the game is most likely the Giant Clockworks Invasion boss, where it takes basically the whole server working together to defeat it. Ironically, the main advertised feature of the game, flying, is really not all that special though. Flying gets unlocked around level 20 or so with a quest. Once you unlock flying, you would think the game pushes you to fly around a ton, but sadly, it doesn't. And honestly, I don't think most players would even want to. Flight in the early levels is really slow and clunky, You'll mainly use it to get around slightly faster or to fight flying monsters. Combat while flying is just not good in my opinion, especially as a melee class. It's incredibly slow and janky trying to fight enemies that will move around constantly, but it is slightly better if you are a class with ranged attacks, or if you get to higher levels and get better flying mounts. And that's basically one of the main points that I've brought up quite a few times in this video. A lot of the game's better features are locked behind higher levels. Better combat, better flying, PvP, dungeons, pets, and more. Now that normally makes sense in MMOs. More and more content becomes available as you play. The problem here in Fly for Fun is, will players generally stick around long enough to experience that higher level content? Remember when I said earlier in the video that I was surprised that the developers never implemented a tutorial in the past 20 years that the game has existed? Well, the developers haven't evolved the game much in general. The way Fly for Fun plays now is largely how it played all the way back 20 years ago. Obviously with some changes here and there, but it is largely the same game. You would think that there would potentially be more new classes to play, new weapon types, or a more engaging new player experience. But nope, there has really only been new added content here and there, which, don't get me wrong, is cool, but think of other MMORPGs that are just as old. Many of them have evolved over the years for the better, or at least changed the gameplay enough to try and keep up with how gaming has changed. I guess you could argue that it's a good thing that Fly for Fun still plays very similar to how it did all those years ago, but I would at least expect new ways to play and engage with the game. But maybe that's just me. Luckily, that's where the community comes in. The community is largely one of the saving graces of Fly for Fun. No matter what version you are playing, there is a dedicated fan base to interact with. Within the first couple of hours of me trying the game out again, I was talking to people and having random conversations as people would walk up, say hello, and even help me tackle quests. The community also still has player-owned shops, as there is no auction house. So whenever you go to town, you'll see tons of players selling items, adding even more to the social atmosphere. The guild system in Fly for Fun is also pretty standard, with guilds having their own chat filter, levels that unlock various perks, guild banks, and guild-specific content like the previously mentioned guild sieges. Basically, the community is strangely one of the most active and vocal, friendly communities I've seen in a retro MMO like this. Usually older MMOs have their players, but everything is so geared towards solo play. But Fly for Fun has so much incentive to party up and make friends. It honestly made me think of the golden days of MMO gaming, and it really made me feel nostalgic. By far, it was one of the clear shining moments in my time with Fly for Fun. One last thing we gotta talk about though is the cash shop. Fly for Fun is a free-to-play game after all, so it has a decently large cash shop with all the usual fix-ins. It has cosmetics, convenience items, pets that pick up items for you, mounts, and upgrade materials that help you progress your character, aka pay-to-win stuff. Basically, all the stuff MMO players have come to expect from free-to-play MMOs are here. Items are relatively cheap in terms of what they cost in the cash shop, usually only being around $5 to $10 each item. Where the cash shop makes a lot of money from whales though is the scrolls that help upgrade your items. Scrolls that prevent items from being destroyed, add stats to equipment, or change perks are some of the pay-to-win items sold in the shop, so as you can imagine, if you have the money, not only can you buy cool cosmetic outfits, you can buy items that will help you make some super powerful equipment when you get to a higher level. Fly for Fun is a decently fun retro MMO. The game has a ton of charm, and honestly, for how hardcore it is, it's right up my alley in terms of its difficulty and progression. But there is some fundamental flaws the game has had that has never been addressed in the 20 years it's been around. It will always have its dedicated player base, but it will always struggle to find newer loyal players. But hey, maybe the developers have some tricks up their sleeves in the coming years. Either way, let's wrap up my thoughts on Fly for Fun. Fly for Fun is one of the oldest free-to-play MMORPGs around. Since the game is free to play, it literally costs nothing to give the game a shot and jump out, if needed, with nothing lost. The game has a decently nice, colorful, cartoony 3D art style going for it. It luckily doesn't suffer from really dated looks that other realistic MMOs went for during this era in gaming. It can basically be ran on a potato nowadays, especially if you're playing Universe, where the game can even be played on your phone. That's a huge cap in the game's favor, as being able to play on the go is incredibly convenient. Finally, the game has a really tight-knit, active community, with people looking to help out new players and ease them into the game. As much as this point can probably be spun as a positive, the game generally hasn't changed much since its initial launch all the way back in 2004-2005. What I mean by this is that there is no new major features or significant changes to the game other than additional content. Why haven't we seen new classes or professions with a proper crafting system? What about a reputation system? I think you get the gist of what I'm saying. Compared to other MMORPGs on the market, Fly for Fun has pretty poor class variety, only having 8 distinct classes to choose from. Most MMORPGs have nearly double what Fly for Fun has to offer, sadly. Progression in general in Fly for Fun just feels so sluggish. Everything is so backloaded into higher level content. Honestly, in the early versions of the game when skills were leveled via use, it was a much better system than the skill point system we have now. Classes in general in combat don't get a lot of skills to play with since you have to build your character optimally to level up at a decent pace. Finally, I don't think anyone would disagree that the game is pay to win. It's a shame that so many of these older free-to-play MMORPGs have such dirty cash shops, but I suppose they have to make money somehow. Still, if Fly for Fun changed some of its outdated gameplay, cleaned up some of its pay-to-win cash shop, and added some new ways to play, the game would have a decent resurgence, but sadly, something like that will most likely never happen. Well, that is Fly for Fun, everyone. A game that I can recommend checking out for maybe a week or so, and then I recommend you move on. I want to like the game more than I do, but it's just an okay time. It has so much charm and style. I wish I could get more into it, but the lack of class variety, and generally other things like crafting professions missing, kills it for me. Anyways, what do you think of Fly for Fun? Are you playing it? Let me know down in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel to support my content. Follow all my social media in the description below if you want, and hopefully I will see you all next time.